Hi, I'm going to talk about dependent numerals in Bengali and argue in favor of a covert adverbial D operator. Dependent numerals are morphologically augmented numerals that must convey distributive readings. Cardinality phrases in Bengali are marked by the presence of a classifier following the determiner. Dependent numerals are formed by adding a suffix kore after the classifier. Compare plain numerals in 1 with the corresponding dependent numerals in 2. So 1a, akjon, meaning 1, corresponds to 2a, akjon kore, meaning 1 each. Okay, and so on and so forth. A dependent numeral in Bengali must be licensed by a C commanding plural expression in the same clause. In 3, which goes like Robi ar Rina duto kore baksho boyeche, translated as Robi and Rina carried different sets of 2 boxes. The dependent numeral duto kore baksho is licensed by Robi ar Rina. The sentence requires there to be 2 boxes for Robi and a different set of 2 boxes for Rina. Thus, the dependent numeral co-varies with its licensor. If Robi ar Rina is replaced with a singular antecedent Rina, the result is infelicitous, as in 4, Rina duto kore baksho boyeche is odd. And 4 does not have the interpretation. Rina carried different sets of 2 boxes on every occasion, which is different from Telugu, as shown by Balusu. Okay. The semantic analysis of adnominal dependent numerals is debated among 2 theoretical positions regarding the source of distributivity in the interpretation of the numeral. One school of analysis, which I've named Covert D, advocates that an operator like the covert adverbial distributivity operator D is instrumental in licensing the covariant interpretation of the dependent numeral. So 2 will be analyzed as 5 with D on the VP. The contrary school of analysis, which I've named lexical distributivity, upholds the position that the source of distributivity resides within the dependent numeral itself. 2 will be analyzed as 6, Robi and Rina duto kore boxes carried, and D is on the dependent numeral. I'll argue in favor of covert D-op analysis and present a dynamic semantic analysis at the end. The arguments that have been presented against analysis like covert D-op are primarily based on predictions related to the scope of an adverbial D operator. A distributive universal quantifier induces certain effects in its scope. An indefinite occurring in the scope of a distributive quantifier can have a covarying interpretation. We can interpret a sentence like 7, every girl carried 3 boxes, to be true in a situation where every girl carried a different set of 3 boxes, right? So that is the covarying interpretation of the indefinite. On the other hand, an indefinite occurring in the scope of a distributive quantifier cannot have a cumulative interpretation. So 7 cannot be true in a situation where Rina carried 2 boxes and Mira carried 1 box, and together they carried a total of 3 boxes, right? So we expect the covert adverbial D operator to induce the same effects on the interpretation of the indefinites in its scope. D will allow covariation of an indefinite in scope, and D will block cumulativity of indefinites in its scope. Okay. However, previous works have presented purported evidence showing that these effects are not attested in constructions involving a dependent numeral. So argumentation based on conjunction of DPs against covert D-op. So Kuhn argued that conjunction of DPs provides a testing ground for the predictions. If a dependent numeral is conjoined with a plain numeral, the VP containing this conjunction of DPs will be in the scope of D that licenses the dependent numeral, as shown by 8. The plain numeral would be predicted to have a covarying interpretation or to not be interpreted cumulatively with respect to the subject. Kuhn showed that cross-linguistically, the plain numeral in such a construction can receive cumulative interpretation, as it has been, as 9 from Bengali also shows. So tinte biryani in mera tinte biryani ar ekta kore firni খেয়েছে can be interpreted cumulatively relative to the subject. So if conjunction of DPs are analyzed like 8, the cumulative interpretation of the plain numeral in 9 would indicate that D does not scope over the VP containing the conjunction, and in effect, it would be an evidence against the adverbial D. I'll have a show later on in section 6.4, a conjunction reduction analysis can nullify this argument. Okay. One might try to argue against covert D by showing that a dependent numeral does not induce covariation on its neighboring DPs. As an internal argument of a ditransitive predicate, the dependent numeral does not force its co-argument to have a covariant interpretation. 10 from Bengali, Robi আর রিনা তিনটে ছেলেকে দুটো করে বই দিয়েছে, where the direct object is the dependent numeral and the indirect object is a plain numeral, can describe a situation with more than 2 books, but it cannot describe a situation with more than 3 boys. It must describe a situation with exactly 3 boys. So it shows that the indirect object cannot have a covariant interpretation just by virtue of the direct object being a dependent numeral. Similarly, 11, with a dependent numeral indirect object and a plain numeral direct object is incompatible with a situation with more than 2 books. Okay, showing that the dependent numeral does not induce covariation on the direct object. But all these examples establish is that covariation is strictly limited to the dependent numerals. They do not actually provide arguments against an adverbial D operator. So now I'll argue in favor of covert D from cumulativity in ditransitives. Recall the prediction: D will block the cumulative interpretation of nominals occurring in its scope. So if a ditransitive predicate has a dependent numeral as one of its internal arguments, covert D would propose a D operator on the little VP containing the internal arguments, as in 12. Okay. So cumulativity related predictions of covert D will be when a ditransitive has a dependent numeral in the internal argument, the other internal argument would resist a cumulative interpretation. So dependent numeral at the direct object position would block indirect object to be cumulative because D is here, and dependent numeral indirect object would block cumulativity of the direct object because of D. I'll present data from Bengali ditransitive showing that these predictions are met. Let's first consider a ditransitive construction in Bengali with a plain numeral at the indirect object position and a dependent numeral at the direct object position. The plain numeral can be interpreted cumulatively with respect to the plural subject if the dependent numeral direct object covaries with the indirect object. Okay. Crucially, however, the plain numeral plurality at the indirect object position cannot be cumulative in relation to the subject when the dependent numeral covaries with the subject. Okay. Let's look at examples. 14, Robi আর রিনা 5টা টেবিলে indirect object, 3টে করে ফুলদানি direct object রেখেছিল. Okay. The sentence cannot be interpreted as Robi and Rina placed 3 flower vases each to a person on a total of 5 tables. Okay. The details of the interpretation. So I call this, let's imagine the cumulative situation. In a room, there were 2 tables and Robi placed 3 flower vases on them. In another room, there were 3 tables and Rina placed 3 flower vases on them. So cumulatively, Robi and Rina placed 6 flower vases, 3 each, on a total of 5 tables. Okay, so that's the cumulative reading of the indirect objects relative to the subject. 14 is false in this situation. So that's what this line of translation represents. And that matches the representation in figure 2 and the prediction 13a from above, which is this, okay? That D being here, the indirect object cannot be cumulative. But the sentence is true in the indirect object licensing situation. Okay, so and what is that? There were a total of 5 tables. Robi placed on 2 tables 3 flower vases each. Rina placed on 3 tables 3 flower vases each. Cumulatively, Robi and Rina placed 15 flower vases on a total of 5 tables. Okay, 14 is true in this situation. Okay, so that's what the second line of translation represents. That matches figure 1 So this scenario, and this is not in conflict with the prediction of Covert D of 13A. Okay. Same can be shown by other ditransitive examples. These interpretation patterns indicate that the availability of a cumulative interpretation of the plain numeral indirect object is dependent on two factors. A, the presence of the dependent numeral direct object, and B, which plural the dependent numeral co-varies with. This exactly matches the predictions of Covert D op. Therefore, this is an argument in favor of Covert D op. Lexical distributivity, however, would have the distributivity operator syntactically located inside the dependent numeral direct object, as in 17. Okay. Delocalized to the direct object position cannot block the cumulative interpretation of the plain numeral of the indirect object position, because that is syntactically beyond the reach of the dependent numeral, not in the scope of the direct object. The lexicalist analysis, therefore, cannot explain why the cumulative interpretation is absent in constructions like 17, okay, or in figure 2 cases. But we need to make sure that indeed the indirect object is beyond the scope of the direct object in Bengali. In Bengali ditransitives, as Bhattacharya and Simpson 2011 has shown, when the indirect object precedes the direct object in linear order, the indirect object scopes over the direct object. Okay. So 18, Hori kono ekjon shikkhokke prottekta boi dilo only has the surface scope reading, which is Hori gave every book to a particular professor, but not the inverse scope, which is Hori gave every book to a different professor, right? So the indirect object, some professor, scopes over the direct object, every book, and not the other way around. Okay. Maintaining the same relative scope and linear order matching pattern, a dependent numeral indirect object cannot be licensed by a plain numeral, by a direct object that linearly follows it, as 19 illustrates, which is odd. Robi ekjon kore shikhokke prottekta boi dilo is odd. Robi gave every book to a different professor. That interpretation is not accessible very smoothly in 19. So conclusions, the dependent numeral direct object in the ditransitive examples above scopes below the linearly preceding plain numeral indirect object, right? So this reinforces the argument against lexical distributivity. Okay, now let's consider the cumulativity of the direct object in a ditransitive construction in Bengali with a dependent numeral indirect object and a plain numeral direct object. What happens is that the plain numeral direct object cannot be cumulative relative to the subject. Okay, so example set 2, 20. Robi আর রিনা দুটো করে টেবিলে, so the dependent numeral is now indirect object. 5টা ফুলদানি রেখেছে, so this is plain numeral direct object. The cumulative direct object situation, in a room, Robi placed 3 flower vases on 2 tables. In another room, Rina placed 2 flower vases on a different set of 2 tables. So cumulatively, Robi and Rina placed a total of 5 flower vases on 2 tables each. Okay. 20 cannot describe this situation, and that meets the prediction 13b of Covert D op, which I've repeated here. So the direct object cannot be cumulative because of D. Same can be shown with other ditransitive examples. So that shows lexical distributivity. Okay, so lexical distributivity does not predict the D operator inside the indirect object would have any direct influence over the direct object to block its cumulative reading, right? So that's again an argument in favor of Covert D op and against lexical distributivity. Okay, so far we have shown that the lack of cumulativity of the co-arguments of dependent numerals supports a Covert D op analysis. A further argumentation can be made from universal quantifier licenses of dependent numerals. Okay, so 24. Every girl carried a different set of 3 boxes. প্রত্যেকটি মেয়ে দুটো করে বাক্স বয়েছে. So Since in covert D dependent numerals do not introduce a distributivity operator themselves, they can be licensed by any commanding distributive quantifier. So a construction like 24 is not a problem for covert D. But in lexical distributivity, dependent numerals introduce a distributivity operator themselves. So under a universal quantifier licensor, like as in 24, in a lexical distributivity analysis, it should lead to additional distributive readings. Okay, that's what 25 shows, because we have two distributive quantifiers, and so in order to handle that, because we actually do not have additional distributive readings in these cases, so in order to handle that, lexical distributivity must resort to extra devices that can rule out these readings, right? So that's a disadvantage sort of for a lexical distributivity account. Right, so now I'll present a sketch of the analysis. The evidence from ditransitives fits covert D neatly while being at odds with the predictions of lexical distributivity. The interpretation possibilities of the indirect object plural changed depending upon whether the dependent numeral covaried with the indirect object or with the subject. In order to formally capture this difference with respect to the licenses, I'll need to use Kuhn's anaphoric linking of the dependent numeral and its licensor. A covert D analysis without this mechanism for relativizing covariation cannot distinguish between the two relevant readings, right? So the analysis in this talk blends Henderson 2014 stand on the source of distributivity or Champollion 2015 stand on the source of distributivity, independent numerals, with Kuhn's position about the need for anaphoric linking between the numerals and their licenses. Okay. Now, the analysis of the ditransitives, the location of the D operator depends upon the licensor of the dependent numeral. When the dependent numeral is licensed by the indirect object plurality, D scopes only over the lower little vp containing a direct object. Okay, so here indirect object has quantifier raised out of this little vp, and D takes as argument the resulting predicate. Analysis 26 allows the indirect object to be cumulative with respect to the subject, as it is not in the scope of D. When the licensor is the subject plurality, D scopes over the higher little vp containing both of the internal arguments. So that does not allow the indirect object to be cumulative relative to the subject, as it is in the scope of D. Okay. Here, the subject has QR'd out of the little vp, and D takes as argument that the resulting predicate. Okay. I request you to please see Appendix C for the interpretation of the ditransitives, and an example of the compositional mechanism can be found in Appendix B.1, page 22. Okay. Now, analysis of the non-cumulative interpretation. What is the available interpretation of the plain numeral when cumulativity is blocked, right? A sentence like 28 is true when there are exactly 5 tables, so the plain numeral indirect object, and false if there are more than 5 tables. Okay, so that shows the plain numeral does not allow a covarying interpretation in this case. Now, let's look at something that I've called the same situation. So there are 5 tables in a room, okay. Roby placed a total of 3 flower vases on them somehow. Okay. Rina too placed 3 flower vases on the same 5 tables, so whichever way she pleased. Okay. So there are 6 flower vases, but exactly 5 tables. Right. So this I've called the same situation, and 28 is true in this situation. Okay. But 28 was false in the cumulative situation, recall from above. Okay. So that's crucial for me, and I argue that we need to be able to grammatically differentiate between the same situation and the cumulative situation from before, even though both are situations where there are exactly 5 tables. Okay. So for that, I'll be using post suppositions. Okay. D rules out the cumulative interpretation as a possible interpretation of the plain numeral. To allow the interpretation exactly 5 tables for the plain numeral under the D operator, I'll propose to use post suppositions, which are like presuppositions, but unlike presuppositions, they are evaluated on the output context. Okay. This I've borrowed from Brasaviano 2013 and Henderson 2014. Brasaviano used cardinality post suppositions to account for the cumulative readings of modified numerals like exactly 3 or exactly 5 in sentences like 31. Exactly 3 boys saw exactly 5 movies. In his analysis, a cardinality post supposition on a modified numeral ensured that its interpretation remained exactly n, particularly under the distributive quantifier, ruling out more than n readings. Okay. The purpose of using post suppositions for Bengali dependent numerals is to allow a dependent numeral and a plain numeral yield more than n and exactly n readings respectively when placed in the scope of D, right? The crucial ditransitive cases. So to account for that, this is my proposal for the numerals. And so one, the dependent numerals and the plain numerals have the same at issue meaning. This is similar to Henderson's proposal. They differ in terms of their not at issue meaning content, namely their post suppositions, which are evaluated on the output of the scope of D. The post supposition on the dependent numeral, which I've named different, ensures that there are different sets of entities satisfying the properties of the indefinite, evaluating the output of D. The post supposition, which I've called same, on the plain numeral, blocking the covariation, ensures that only one set of entities picked out by the plain numeral. And finally, the dependent numerals are not inherently distributive. A covert adverbial D operator licenses them, or any other C commanding distributive operator. Okay. So I request you to please look at Appendix 1 to see the formal details of the proposal for numerals. Okay. Last 2 points before I finish. Covert D predicts that when the direct object position hosts a dependent numeral covariing with the subject, the indirect object too potentially can host an indefinite covariing with the subject. So basically 32. So if D is here, both can covary. The plain numeral is barred from expressing covariation in this case, as we just saw. But we could have 2 dependent numerals as indirect object covariing with the subjects. That's what 33 shows. Indirect object is a dependent numeral, direct object is a dependent numeral, and we can get a reading. Roby and Rina place different sets of 3 flower vases per person on different sets of 5 tables per person, right? So that's one prediction of covert D that's met. Okay. Finally, reanalysis of the object DP conjunction. I'll propose that Kuhn's evidence in 34 repeated from above, or the example 35, instantiating the prediction is not conclusive. And the object DP conjunction is in fact a conjunction of little VPs in a conjunction reduction analysis proposed by Hirsch's work. So what's that analysis? So 35 will be analyzed as 36 as a conjunction of little VP in a conjunction reduction analysis, right? This analysis involves raising of the subject out of the 2 conjuncts and the right mode raising of the verb out of each conjunct, right? Crucially, D will take scope only on the 2nd conjunct with the dependent numeral, right? Thus, D in this analysis has no influence over the 1st conjunct, letting the object DP in the 1st conjunct be open to any kind of interpretation, cumulative or non-cumulative, okay? So that's it. I'll end my talk here because of time restrictions, but I do encourage you to look at the appendices where I lay out the formal details that I've tried to work out. especially section Appendix A1 with the meaning components of the numerals. Okay, and section C has, section D instantiates the compositional mechanism, right? And section C plays out the interpretation of the ditransitives. Okay, please look at them and do send your comments to me, to my email, and thank you for listening to me.